Good afternoon for me, those who are in the European side. Good morning, wherever you are. A warm welcome to today's webinar. We have encountered a small technical problem, so David is ramping up his computer again. So give us another 1 or 2 minutes, and maybe in the meantime, while he is trying to reconnect, let me tell you what WiN for Peace is all about, because there may be some of you who have never listened to our webinars. So let me show you. Wait a second, 1 moment. Okay, I hope you can all see my presentation. So today's webinar will be about, it's our 5th webinar, it will be about the AQKhan network. Who was AQKhan and what were his major contributions or how his main implications on the nuclear non-proliferation. And we are very honored to have our guest speaker, David Albright, here today. And I will introduce him after these few slides I'm going to show you now. So what is WiN for Peace? WiN for Peace is one of the WiN global groups of expertise. It has the objectives to promote activities, training and collaboration in 4 areas: nuclear non-proliferation, safeguards, export controls, and disarmament. And the objective of WiN for Peace is to educate and to make more women interested in these important fields in order to increase the number of female professionals who could be working in these fields. We do this by conducting educational and training sessions, most of them in virtual format like this webinar. In the future, we may have hybrid and physical sessions as well, whenever the opportunity arises. And our webinars are open to all WiN Global members and beyond. So I encourage all those of you who are not yet members of WiN Global to consider joining WiN Global. WiN Global is a worldwide network for women and men working in different nuclear fields, and we welcome both men and women. So you can find more information how to join WiN on the WiN Global website. In WiN for Peace, we currently have 16 members. I'm the leader of this group, and we have 2 supporters. One is the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, the VCDNP. And the other one is the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, UNODA at Vienna. So far, we have conducted 4 webinars. The first one was together with our inauguration ceremony on the foundations of the international non-proliferation regime. In March, we talked about safeguards basics and looked at implementation experiences by the IAEA, ABAC, Euratom, and the Argentinian Nuclear Regulatory Authority. In May, we spoke about Iran's nuclear program and why it is of concern. In June, we touched upon the nuclear export control basics. What are nuclear export controls and why are they important? And today is actually also related to nuclear export controls. Today, as I've said, we will speak about the AQKhan network. And David Albright will tell us who was AQKhan and what was his impact on the global non-proliferation regime. We have scheduled 2 more webinars for this year. One will be probably end of August or beginning of September on disarmament concepts and the current status. This webinar will be delivered after the NPT pre-review conference that is currently taking place in Vienna. And we will expect some news about the current status of the preparation for the next NPT review conference. And last not least, in October, we plan to invite the VCDMP to tell us what they do and also to speak about AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US nuclear powered submarine project. And there may be another webinar before the end of the year. So again, a warm welcome, and let's hope that David is now on or connected. So give us a moment or two. I would also like to say that if you have any questions, please could you type them into the chat while David is talking, so that we can moderate them at the end of his speech. He will speak for about 45-50 minutes, and then we will go over to the question and answer session. So let's see now whether David has been able to join us. And I ask for my two helpers. By the way, I would like to say a big thank you to Agostina Serrano Betancourt and Florencia Reteno from the Argentinian nuclear regulator, who are really always helping me with these webinars, because it's really not always easy to be speaking and organizing, and they are doing all the background work. So I'm very grateful to them for this. Let's give a warm welcome to Mr. David Albright, whom probably most of you who work in the nuclear non-proliferation safeguards export controls will know. David Albright is the founder and director of ISIS, the Institute for Science and International Security. And he has done a lot of research on clandestine nuclear networks, on export control, on the AQKhan network. I had the pleasure of first meeting David when he came to our nuclear export control forum to Dubai in 2018 to present the Peddling Peril Index, which was quite new at that time, which he had compiled together with, I think it was with Sarah, right? Yes. Sarah Burkhardt. And it's a ranking of all states in the world, depending on their export control credentials, looking at the commitments based on UN Security Council Resolution 1540 and other criteria. And before, I think before David made the Peddling Peril Index, he wrote a book. Oops, where's my camera? The Peddling Peril, which I read extensively and marked up extensively, because that's actually a really profound research of the AQKhan network and of the dealings of AQKhan. And when I met David in Vienna in May and asked him whether we would talk to us about this topic, he kindly agreed. So let us welcome David, and thank you very much, David, for being here today, and I hand over to you. I hope the video will work in your presentation as well. And please, I remind you all, please put your questions into the Q&A as soon as they come up. Thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. Happy to do this. I mean, it's been a long time since I worked on the Khan network, but I worked on it a considerable amount and was also involved in advising prosecutors of various Khan network members in 2004 through about 2007. So it's immersed in the details. And I wrote the book Peddling Peril to try to come up with a more readable rendition of the whole experience, which I'll go through over the next 45 minutes or so. And I think as cases go, this was probably one of the most important for nonproliferation. I mean, it really kind of rocked the system to its core, and I appreciate Ava wanting to relook at it. I think we need to remind ourselves about what's happened in the past, and often we may have incorporated some lessons, but not all of them. I think it's a background to this. It's just a reality of nuclear weapons programs that they've depended on foreign assistance. Even if you've seen the Oppenheimer film, many people, many of the lead scientists speak English with an accent. Their brains, in a sense, the foreign brains were very important to the success of the Manhattan Project. After that, U.S. helped Britain. I mean, and Russia stole the technology from the U.S. for its first bomb, and so it's just gone on like that. And I think in my work at the Institute, we've never found a country that didn't depend on foreign assistance to a larger or lesser extent. And what I want to do is talk about one of the kind of the strangest and most dangerous of these programs. Because this program, and I'm talking about Pakistan, not only depended extensively on foreign assistance, but some members of the program, particularly its leader, AQKhan, decided that they could exploit that weakness in other countries' programs and make money at it, or gain some other kinds of benefits for themselves or Pakistan by providing the wherewithal to build nuclear weapons. In the case of, well, let me just briefly say who Khan was. He was actually born in Bhopal, India in 1936. After the partition of India, his family left for Pakistan, and he was 15 at the time, and it deeply affected him, and he was particularly affected by the atrocities that were committed during that era by both sides, but certainly you feel the ones toward your own group much more fiercely. He was a very bright student, and he moved to Europe to get his master's degree and PhD. And in 1972, he joined what's called the Physical Dynamic Research Laboratory in Amsterdam. And that was a contractor for Europe's leading uranium enrichment consortium called Urenco. And while Khan was there, he was also affected by the war that started between India and Pakistan, where India seized or led to the, I don't quite know how to call it, but the dismemberment of Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh. And he became a very avid nationalist. And these factors of sort of when he was 15, the dismemberment of Pakistan, figured prominently in what he was subsequently going to do. And what he did was, and I'll talk through it more chronologically in a minute, but he saw an opportunity to steal technology that was way beyond Pakistan's capabilities and bring it home, and then put together a network to create the capabilities to be able to make, they're called gas centrifuges, and also the technology to run them, maintain them, and then technology to create what's called uranium hexafluoride. Uranium is turned into a gaseous material by uniting it with fluorine, and then that's fed in and enriched in these gas centrifuges. All these steps are extremely difficult, way beyond anything Pakistan could have done for 20 years, 30 years into the future from that point in time. But he had this idea that he could provide this gift to Pakistan at a moment when Pakistan was in a crisis with India and reeling from the defeat in the war. And his gift was recognized. And I personally think, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, was that he was recruited into what amounted to a Pakistani espionage ring aimed at Urenco and its contractors and suppliers. And so Khan was critical, but he isn't the kind of godlike figure that he's tried to present himself in the past. He's now dead, or that some of his supporters have, that he had a gift, but the Pakistani government realized that it was a tremendous gift, and they were going to maximize their ability to exploit it. Now, that network that he created really became what we now call the AQKhan network, then went on to proliferate. And before I get into the whole story, I'd like to just show some pictures of some centrifuges. Something. And I don't know your backgrounds, and I would say if you have questions about some of the technical things I'm talking about, please feel free to kind of do a two-handed intervention, and Ava can interrupt me. But here's some schematics of centrifuges. Essentially, what a centrifuge is a spinning top, but it spins at the rotor. This metal tube spins at the speed of a bullet fired from a pistol. So it requires a great deal of precise engineering to make sure that it doesn't wobble a little bit, hit the side, and then it will explode like it's shrapnel going off, bomb going off in a sense, but it'll produce a lot of shrapnel. And so this cylinder is within a thick aluminum cylinder to keep this metal shrapnel from escaping and injuring people. And in that, while it's spinning, it'll separate uranium, and then there's some other effects going on, which is shown on the left side, but I'm not going to go into that, kind of accelerate the separation, and also you end up with, in this case, greater concentrations of uranium at the bottom and less concentration of uranium-235 at the top. And it just again as background, if you're going to make a bomb from enriched uranium, you want to increase the fraction of uranium-235. That's the valuable isotope for making a bomb. And so typically you start with natural uranium that's 0.1% uranium-235. And you want to get it up to 90% uranium-235. You can use less. 80% can also work. Hiroshima bomb only had about 80% enriched uranium in it, but if you're a bomb designer, 90 is a sweet spot for enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon, but that is difficult to do, and as you all know from chemistry, you can't chemically separate isotopes, so the procedures to actually separate are complicated. And a centrifuge has turned out to probably be the very best way to do it. It's been proven economical. It's used worldwide, and again, Khan had the insight in the 70s when those two things weren't necessarily proven, to realize that this was something that could be of great value to Pakistan. And he was working at the Uranium Enrichment Consortium, URENCO, which had the very, very good centrifuges. Here's some pictures. This is in Iran. It's the former president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, and he's walking among what we call cascades of Iranians call it IR1 centrifuges. They're actually P1 centrifuges, which is for Pakistan. In fact, you'll see that Libya had L1 centrifuges, and this P1 centrifuge was essentially a close copy of one of the URENCO centrifuges that Khan stole. I show this. There's a lot of piping in the centrifuge plant. Each centrifuge only enriches a little bit and only enriches up a little bit. And so you have to have thousands of them working together, and you hook them into cascades. Oh, could you not see the screen before? Well, here's a.
We can see, David, we can see everything. Thank you.
Okay. Another design Khan stole was a German design called the G2. And that is a remarkably good centrifuge. And Pakistan pretty quickly replaced its P1 centrifuges with P2 centrifuges. And here's a picture of this rotor tube that would be spinning, and that this was found in or provided to Libya by the Khan network, and then subsequently sent to the United States for safekeeping. But it shows that just shows what it looks like, and that's what goes inside this thick cylindrical container. And I'll show a picture of that later. Now, what I'd like to do is go through fairly quickly some of the things on what Khan did for Pakistan in the 70s. And I think I summarized it, but really 74 was a critical date when Khan saw this opportunity to help his country. And he went back to Pakistan at Christmas and made his offer to Prime Minister Bhutto. And Bhutto sent him back to his Urenco contractor to gather documents. And that's where Bhutto, I believe, set up this espionage network, and it was run out of the Pakistani embassy in Brussels. And then at Christmas 1975, he went back to Pakistan and did not return. And he quickly started working at the Pakistani Atomic Energy Commission. He had some struggles there, but he emerged on top of at least ahead the uranium enrichment program. That was not foreordained when he had gone back. And he started a small plant at what's called Sihala, and then later developed the main enrichment plant at Kahuta. And as soon as he got back, he also started to approach former colleagues in Urenco contractors. He approached supplier countries, the United States and Europe, for materials and equipment. And these intermediaries were in it for the money. They preferred thinking Pakistan wasn't building a nuclear weapon. They weren't committed to helping any country build nuclear weapons, but they were heavily committed to making money and more than willing to turn a blind eye to whatever was going on. And I've interviewed many of these people over the years. It's amazing what they can kind of turn away from and the kind of facts that they can ignore. And then if you really push them against the wall, they'll say, well, India has it, Pakistan needs it. I mean, Iraqi program in the 1980s, nuclear weapons program. Some people hating that program would tell me, well, Israel has them, Iraq should have them. So I mean, there's between money and kind of this phony idea that nuclear weapons, if one side has them, the other side should have them. That's somehow good. Is pretty prevalent among these illicit traffickers. By 1979, the German press revealed what was going on. Urenco had actually knew about it, and there was more and more concern, but not many ways to stop Pakistan that were developed that were effective. And Pakistan first deployed the P1, and then eventually moved toward the P2, and press reports increased. I mean, there was press reports in 84, 85 that China had given Pakistan nuclear weapons designs and some highly enriched uranium. Pakistan was having trouble getting everything to work, but China would have stepped in two important ways to help Pakistan build the bomb. And then in the late 80s, the P1 is gradually replaced by the P2. And I'll take note, I note this, the P1 was removed, but not destroyed. They were stored. There were thousands of them, and they were stored. And that is one of the things Khan sought to sell later. This one, I'll go over quickly. I'll just make the point. These are the names of some of the suppliers, or let's say facilitators, during the period 76 to 87. They're from various parts of Europe. And each name isn't important, but you can see that this network was already transnational: England, Germany, Liechtenstein, Turkey, Switzerland. There's some people in UAE that aren't even on here, Netherlands, and many of them were very committed to working with Khan, and they will appear again during the Khan network proliferation activities 20 years later. Now let me go through some of the sales. I mean, the first really important one was the offer to Iran in about 1985 to 1987. And this one was partly taken up, but Iran did start its secret centrifuge program, and it went off send its people off to Europe to buy equipment from the same companies that had been selling to Pakistan, and same people, intermediaries in many cases got involved in supplying Iran. There was an offer to South Africa by Lair. He was mentioned on the previous slide. He's a German, and he's very, very senior, in a sense, a senior official in this whole Khan network. He tried to sell centrifuges to South Africa through a company that was involved in this, and South Africans declined. They didn't need the help, basically. They had their own centrifuge program. In 1990, Khan made an offer to Iraq, and to show some of the reasons why US people are so uncomfortable with this guy is he made this offer, right after Saddam had invaded Kuwait, and it was clear the international community was going to push back. So he steps in with an intermediary in October of 1990 to say, look, I can help you. And here's this comes from the Iraqi inspections there in 1990. This document was found by inspectors. And here's his offer. An AB is atomic bomb. And the Iraqis were talking about this. They weren't denying this happened by any means. They said they didn't take up the offer, although there's I won't show it, or I'll skip over it, but there's correspondence that was also found that shows they were certainly interested in. And particularly because in the fall of 1990, they launched a crash nuclear weapons program to try to build the bomb as quickly as they could using safeguarded, highly enriched uranium. And it was only stopped by the bombing raids of January 1991. But they were suspicious. I mean, somebody approaches you and look at the offer, we're going to help you build the bomb in 3 years, and you'll spend half as much money as we did. You'll get the detailed design and the actual blueprint of an atomic bomb. It'll be at the price of $5 million. And we'll undertake to procure all the vital components and supply them through our Dubai office with a 10% commission. All technological assistance will also be provided through the Dubai office, and that'll be free advice, and that's worth its weight in gold. And then there can be meetings every 3 to 4 months to review the project. And they also offered to send 2 to 3 scientists from Pakistan who would resign from the Pakistani program and join this new assignment. So it's quite an offer to both build nuclear weapons and produce the weapon grade uranium for those bombs. And this is the memo where the internal memo discussing it, and worried that it could be a setup. And so they want to get a sample. They want to make sure the Iraqis don't reveal anything about their program to the intermediary, and it kind of fizzled out. But interestingly, the crash program by Iraq didn't. So I think they also felt that it's better to go alone than with Khan. In 1990-91, there was a second offer to Libya. I skipped over the first one, but it was pretty insignificant or was undermined. But and this one was disrupted by the UN embargo. People say, oh, embargoes don't do anything. Well, that embargo stopped Libya's nuclear weapons program. And it really didn't start again until, until that embargo was lifted. I think that's correct. In 94-95, the Khan people made a second offer to Iran, both to supply P1 components and P2 design, and that offer was accepted. And they also received 500 of these dismantled IR1 P1 centrifuges. That became the core of their program for many years. North Korea was offered centrifuge technology, or really, probably the best way to put it, and I'll come back to this, is they asked for it for various reasons, and Khan said yes. And through all these offers, they were expanding in scope and becoming more complete, more thought through. Design, technology, technical data was being digitized to make it easier to transmit. The people knew who could help on what particular topic, and so the whole effort was becoming more organized. Libya is clearly was the network's most successful customer. It literally ordered a turnkey gas centrifuge plant. The North Korea or Iran, it was pieces of it, help along the way of already existing programs. Here's a program in Libya that essentially non-existent, and Libya was going to provide a turnkey facility and nuclear weapons designs. And it set up factories. People set up factories. Here's an example of one called Scope in Malaysia. They were making, and this is the outer casing, that P2 cylinder that I showed would fit inside this. Here's a view from the top of the outer casing. There are all kinds of parts in a centrifuge. Here's many more that were being made at Scope. In South Africa, this cascade system, which involves a place where you put in the uranium hexafluoride, the natural form, and then the place where you take out the enriched uranium. And then there's also a waste stream of depleted uranium. And in the South African node, it was more or less headed by LERC, but again, with Krish, I'll just say Krish involved in it deep. And that they made it and assembled it in South Africa to make sure everything was okay. And then they subsequently dismantled it and prepared it for shipping in a whole bunch of shipping containers. And here's a shipping container with the cascade piping. There's piping everywhere in a centrifuge plant. And so that's some of the pipe. I always have to mention the technical data insistence. People often forget that just how important it is. And in today's world, when people are worried about intellectual property being stolen, particularly scientific and military engineering, it's the reason you worry is because with it, then you can then build that object. Without it, even if you get the parts, you may not be able to operate it. You certainly probably won't be able to recreate it. I mean, reverse engineering only goes so far. And the Khan people were more than willing to provide technical data of all kinds. I could go into much greater detail. I'll just give two examples. I mean, this one looks fairly innocuous. It's handwriting by a senior Pakistani, but what it did is it shows the throughputs in the planned Libyan centrifuge plant, that it would be fed with 50 tons of natural uranium per year, be in the form of uranium hexafluoride, and then through a process, the plant would produce 96.25 kilograms of weapon-grade uranium per year, essentially enough for three to four bombs a year. And they also provided a bomb design, which needed about 25 kilograms of weapon-grade uranium, and that was exactly the bomb design China gave Pakistan in the early 1980s. Here's a more sophisticated. This is the plan. The Khan people designed the centrifuge plan, and so here's one of the schematics. They call it a water treatment plant, or well, this one Ginkgo steel drawing. They had various names for it, and the little kind of longish stick-like objects are actually cascades of centrifuges. And so this would be the plant that they would provide to Libya. Yeah, I'm going to skip over the details on Iran. The main thing is that Iran had its own procurement networks. It's certainly benefited from the Khan networks, but it also had its own, and it activated them to get the centrifuge. And since here Iran went shopping in Europe, And they developed a pretty successful program. And we're still, to this day, trying to find ways to thwart Iran's illegal procurements for its nuclear program. Now it's expanded missile program, its drone program, and also trying to disrupt Iran's ongoing action to provide a kamikaze drone factory to Russia. And here's an interesting example. Russia depends on Iran's technology and experience to build this drone factory at Al Buga. It's called, the factory name is Al Buga, but it's Al Buga Free Trade Zone in Russia. The people who are running that facility could not build that drone, the Shahed 136, on their own. And so it's not high tech. They could eventually learn how to do it, but here you have Iran short-circuiting the process and providing all the critical technology and parts to Al Buga. And we've been looking at hundreds of drones being used in Ukraine. This plant wants to make 6,000 in the next year and a half and learn how to swarm them. So it's a nightmare. But again, it's how do you disrupt that? And so this problem of the Khan network is in a sense in a different formulation, but it's still with us. Here's the, for Iran, here's the key players that have been identified. Mavis was on the earlier list. Lair, Friedrich Chinner, the F-Tinner, was on the list. He recruited his two sons, Urs and Marco, to join the effort. And not only with Iran, but Libya. And then Sire from Turkey was on the earlier list. North Korea's program was a bit of a opportunistic case. North Korea had looked into centrifuges in the 1980s, didn't do very much with them. They had a deal with Pakistan government in around 1994 to buy the Pakistan's Gori missile and make it the no-dong missile in North Korea. And the North Koreans went to Pakistan to teach the Pakistanis how to build the more sensitive components. The people who were being taught were at Khan's research laboratory, KRL. And in fact, Pakistanis were teaching the North Koreans in the very workshop that makes P2 centrifuge components. And the North Koreans looked at that and said, oh, we're interested in learning how to make P2 components. Would you teach it? And the Pakistanis said yes. And so they were taught how to make these components and then provided technology on the manufacturing, the cascade arrangements, and various other things. And North Koreans then started their first a small scale enrichment program in the 1990s and then expanded that greatly in the early 2000s. And cooperation between KRL and Khan continued and probably would have continued if the Khan network had not been busted up. And I think there was kind of a lull in the North Korean centrifuge program, and it could very well have been due to they expected ongoing assistance from Khan's people, and it just ended suddenly, and then they had to kind of pick up the pieces and move on. Now, in terms of uncovering the network, I mean, I think looking back historically, it's a huge success story. Living through it, it was a bit of a nightmare of missed signals and lost opportunities. It was just, the intelligence communities had a very hard time figuring out or taking seriously that Khan was proliferating. They clearly could see that Khan was buying, and his associates were buying for the Pakistani centrifuge and nuclear weapons program. That was very visible to them. But they missed this other, the things going the other way. And it wasn't until about 2000 that they first really became convinced that, yeah, that's definitely happening. But they only saw part of it. And they wanted more information about the network and its customers. And it wasn't until about 2002 when British intelligence concluded that the network was too widespread or was widespread, and that Khan controlled the operation through a group of associates in Dubai. And that they had learned by then that Khan had established production facilities outside Pakistan, which is one of the things that makes this network so scary. Is Khan's saying, look, I'm not going to make them in Pakistan, which could be under US and MI6 surveillance. I'm going to have them made over in Malaysia, which has no export controls, doesn't have a clue about a centrifuge. No one's looking there. It's not as if US and MI6 have assets there. And also they use Dubai, another place without export controls and not much surveillance. And so they, after another year, as they solidified their knowledge, then they became very nervous and decided to take it out. And they had been watching the tinners in Switzerland for years. In fact, that's one of the things they missed, is they saw the tinners helping Pakistan, but despite it being right under their noses, they missed the tinners' help on the proliferation aspects to other countries. And they've been very active with Libya and Iran. And also the tinners were key leaders and very active in Malaysia and in the Dubai operations. And the CIA just signed them up essentially as agents. And there's some dispute about when, but clearly by June 2003, there's paperwork that the Swiss government has obtained that shows the contract between the Tinner family and the CIA. And at that time, Urs Tinner was very focused on the operations at Scope in Malaysia, making centrifuge components. And the intelligence community decided, well, let's seize those components and have concrete evidence of a secret gas centrifuge program in Libya. And so Urs provided basically cargo information, what's in the cargoes and the timing of when shipments, particular shipments, would go off to Dubai, and then they could monitor from Dubai toward Libya. And they did that, and some containers with these components were put on the BBC China, and that ship was then seized. And it was in October 2003, it was diverted to Italy. And the seizure, as I said, had resulted in direct evidence of a secret substantial Libyan gas centrifuge program. And that was used to confront Libya, Gaddafi in particular. And at that point, they became much more forthcoming about its past nuclear weapons efforts and concrete steps to give it up. And I should say concrete steps means here verifiable steps. It's not enough just to get his word, Gaddafi's word, that something will end. And after Libya's announcement on December 19th, 2003, that it would abandon all its WMD programs, it had chemical programs. I forget if they had biological, missile. Anyway, the IA started an intensive verification effort to assure that Libya's nuclear declarations were correct and complete. And I must say, a lot of the reason we have a great amount of information about the Khan network is because of what the IA did. The US effort on verification was, looking back, was slightly cursory and wasn't slipshod, but it didn't in any way compare to the thorough investigation launched by the International Atomic Energy Agency to figure out, has Libya told the truth? In the sense, is its declaration correct? And has it told all the truth? And that second part is the hardest part to do, but the most important in most of these cases, such as Libya. Same with Iran. It's always, what did they leave out? Still wrestling with that in terms of their nuclear weapons efforts. But Libya cooperated. They didn't, I wouldn't say they were like the South African nuclear weapons people, that after they gave it up were much more forthcoming. But what Libya would do, he would agree to let the IA have access. So the IA realized there was a centrifuge manufacturing plant being built in Libya. You have to do that with a centrifuge. I didn't mention that, but you have to be making the centrifuges. And you do that in a manufacturing plant that can make thousands a year. So you need lots of machine tools, lots of materials. And the IA people asked to go to the centrifuge manufacturing site, which was not finished at the time. A lot of the equipment was still in boxes, and the Libyans didn't object. And they went there, and they basically, with that effort that they then launched, they unpeeled kind of this onion of the Khan network's procurement network, because you could see who sold, how much, what they sold, when they sold it. And it was actually nice that it hadn't been unpacked, because it had all the shipping documents in it, in the boxes. So they, and the US had not done that. So I think a lot of the reason we know a great deal about South African case and Tinners and a lot of the things in Dubai is because of what the IA did. And then that evidence was not classified, it wasn't secret. It could be provided to member states, which could then use it to launch their own prosecutions of Khan network members. The IA was also active in Iran, investigating the IR-1 centrifuge, which they could see was the same as the P1. They could then see that the IR-1 was identical to the L1 in Libya, and make the connection again to Pakistan proliferating. US had to put pressure on Pakistan, but I think the leadership of Pakistan saw the writing on the wall, and the US basically said, look, a lot of this is going to become public very soon, and do you want to get ahead of this locomotive or not? And they decided to get ahead of it, and they arrested Khan February of 2004. And then they, after his arrest, Khan confessed to selling sensitive nuclear technology components and equipment to Libya, Iran, and North Korea. He also took all the blame, which isn't completely fair, but certainly one can imagine that was one of the conditions imposed on him by the Pakistani government, is you're gonna take the blame alone. We're not gonna let you spread the blame around as is fitting. Was there justice for the Khan network? I would say no, but people tried. There were 22 senior Khan network members identified. As I mentioned, Khan was arrested. He was put under house arrest for several years, but he was eventually freed. And he died recently. By about 2010, 7 were deceased or too old to prosecute, because I remember these people were also, many of them, working in the 70s with Khan. And they weren't young men when they were. 10 did serve sentences. Blair, for example, was in jail a year or two. Had to pay a 4 or 5 million euro fine. 2 were released after questioning, and 2 could not be found. And then another 40 or so names were identified, but not prosecuted or seriously investigated. I think our own list was about 50 of people that could be clearly identified as working in the Khan network. And obviously most were not prosecuted. And in fact, it raises one of the issues I know, is that we all live in national systems, and we don't work well transnationally in many cases, or let me say just in a few cases, and we always rejoice when that kind of unity happens. Prosecutions are national, but the evidence was transnational. And so what you needed in South Africa may be in Germany, maybe in Dubai, and so if it was the South African node, it was worth it to the South African government to do the work necessary. I even remember facilitating the exchange of information, at least particularly on an informal level, so that the South African knew what the evidence was. It was in Germany, for example, and then could decide, do they want to go the formal route and really pursue it? Swiss government, when they started, had almost no knowledge of what a centrifuge was. Whenever I was asked to advise the Swiss prosecutors, 2004 or so, who is Khan? What did he do? And I was given quite a bit of the evidence that had been collected by that point in time, and they struggled to understand it. They learned a lot over the years. They also learned that the CIA was working in their country, and the CIA didn't want them prosecuting, and so they had to work to make sure that they could conduct their prosecution effectively without undermining what the CIA had done. There was quite a dance that lasted until 2012, when the Tinners went to trial in a plea deal. Let me just take stock and then talk about some lessons. Then we'll have about a half hour for questions. Let me just go through this. By the late 1990s, the Khan network had evolved into an organization that provide, quote, one-stop shopping for nuclear weapons designs and instructions in the wherewithal to produce weapons-grade uranium. Khan network exploited loopholes in the then existing nationally based export and safeguard systems and legal systems, as I just said, and created a transnational network of suppliers, manufacturers, and shippers that provided secret nuclear technology to Iran, Libya, North Korea, and probably others. Go into that later if there's interest. Iran and Libya would have been blocked in their efforts to achieve nuclear weapons capability, absent assistance from the Khan network. Iran would not have a gas centrifuge program today if Khan had not provided, Khan's people, it is a large group, had not provided that assistance. They just would have struggled with whatever they were working on. And in fact, when they went to build centrifuges in the 80s, they didn't even really start until they had that initial assistance from Pakistan. And then they went to the companies that they had realized or learned were assisting Khan's enrichment program. And again, these transfers went largely undetected, and any hints of these dangerous activities were not pursued aggressively for years. So I think some of this could have been busted up in the 90s, but just opportunities were not taken. And I want to end with, well, I'll come to some lessons, but I think the thing to keep in mind is this was a tremendous shock to the international community. You had the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Mohammed El-Baradei, deeply upset and making statements about, how serious this was. Part of the problem had been that no one had believed that nuclear proliferation on that scale was possible, particularly one operating transnationally and buying commercially. And if you think about IA safeguards until that point, they focused on Iraq and they focused on Iran. Of course, they're looking at exports and imports, but those are very small fraction of what is really necessary to build a centrifuge plant. I mean, look at uranium exports and imports. And the IA really woke up to, and particularly because of what they were doing by digging deeply into Libya, that they fully now realize just you've got to be looking transnationally as well as nationally at what's going on. And that means you've got to focus on the procurements that a country's making, whether they're required to reveal them in a safeguards agreement or not, you still focus on. Also, again, I don't know your background, but the Khan network heavily motivated the Security Council passing Resolution 1540, which requires all states to criminalize proliferation to non-state actors. And that is well known, the anti-terrorism part. But then the second part, to establish, review, and maintain appropriate and effective national export controls systems. That was inserted in reaction to the Khan network. There was an expansion of the Proliferation Security Initiative. As I mentioned, IA safeguards inspections were strengthened, and it's really IA process of determining whether a declaration is incomplete was improved. export controls were improved around the world, and there was much less tolerance for states without them. That UAE, Malaysia could not have export controls and yet be where huge amounts of undeclared nuclear activities are going on, highly sensitive nuclear activities are going on, was just seen as no longer tolerable. And then there's also a renewed focus on the dangers of illicit trade. And that continues to this day. Now, I don't think we can't, in my institute, we don't think there's any con networks today. We're in a bit of a kind of a lull in proliferation, but it's, we don't know is this is kind of a lull that's where we're sitting on top of a hill and things are going to start rolling sooner. Are we in a valley? And it would take real work to push that proliferation ball up the hillside. And we're certainly watching if Iran decides to build nuclear weapons or the nuclear weapons tensions in Northeast Asia just become unbearable. Nonetheless, illicit nuclear trade, which is now organized by states or organized by states, it's always been organized by states for their own programs and continues and remains challenging to stop. And as time goes on, more weaknesses in IAEA inspections have been seen, and there's a need to continue bolstering those inspection efforts. and there are the problems are seen in the process with Iran over Iran's inadequate and well, let me just say over Iran's undeclared nuclear materials that the IAEA has established exist. And then there's always a need to further strengthen and better implement strategic trade controls and sanctions and to get countries to work together on these things. And we're learning and seeing opportunities about that in the Ukraine case, and in particular, how Russia outfits its military industries, where it's heavily dependent on Western and Japanese supply, often facilitated through China. But that if Russia was, in a sense, if a wall was erected around Russia today, its military industries would not be able to function for very long. They'd have stockpiles, but they so depend on Western goods, electronic goods, materials. I mean, it's in the reason isn't because they can't do it. It's just that after the end of the Cold War and the demise of their own military industries, as inefficient, uneconomical, they realized that buying abroad was the way to go, and no one thought that was a bad idea in the 1990s. No one was trying to keep Russia from maintaining and building up its military forces. And therefore, Russia went to just take the economical route of buying things internationally, components. And only after 2014 did people start to wake up that that's not a great idea, not a great arrangement, and we've been catching up ever since. So let me end there, and thank you very much. Happy to try to answer questions.
Thank you very much, David, for giving us this comprehensive recapitulation of AQKhan and his impact of what he did on the non-proliferation regime. As we could see, without him, well, of course, Pakistan wouldn't have had an HEU nuclear weapon. North Korea wouldn't have an enrichment program and an HEU weapon. Libya's program was dismantled on time, and I think they didn't have the capabilities at that time. But of course, the major impact is Iran's program, and Iran is enriching up to 60% now, and it's just very few steps away from producing HEU if they make the decision to do so. And as you said, without AQKhan, they wouldn't have for sure gotten to where they are now. They then just indigenized the program by building all these different types of centrifuges by themselves. But of course, this was triggered by the knowledge they acquired through the network. So thank you very much for this. So I think we should not forget this historical case, because with nowadays technologies and ways of spreading information in the world, I think this has become even easier than it was 20 years ago or 25 years ago. Let's look at some of the questions in the chat. We have one question: why AQKhan's deeds were not stopped in time? And
Could you say that again?
The person who asked this question is little bit confused of why AQKhan's deeds were not stopped in time. Why did it take so many decades before it was actually stopped?
I think in a sense, the original sin was a U.S. decision in the late 1970s and early 1980s that stopping Pakistan's nuclear weapons program would take a back seat to getting Pakistan's help in Afghanistan to defeat Russia or undermine what Russia was doing in Afghanistan. And so they pulled their punches. The U.S. acted very quickly in the 70s to understand the illicit procurement network of Pakistan and moved to demarche and take other actions to try to bust up that network. I think they could have put tremendous pressure on Pakistan. They would have had to provide things, security guarantees of some type, or some deal with the whole crisis between Pakistan and India. Pakistan was clearly feeling deeply insecure, but instead, I think the U.S. decided, now we want their help in Afghanistan, and it was one of these things I mentioned earlier. Well, if India has them, Pakistan needs them. I can't tell you the number of U.S. officials in the Reagan administration who I would talk to in 85, 86, who would say exactly that to me. You know, one of them even said to me, you know, at that time, well, maybe it'd be good if Romania got the bomb. I don't know if you remember Ceausescu. I'm saying his name, but maybe it'd be good if Romania got the bomb. So I mean, you have this problem of priorities, and then after the United States blinked, or the U.S. government or the U.S. administration blinked, U.S. Congress stepped in and started taking actions, creating barriers to Pakistani proliferation or progress forward. But U.S. administration that doesn't agree with the congressional action can usually find ways to sidestep it. And if you remember, if you're old enough, the whole debate, did Pakistan put the last screw in the bomb? If they did, then U.S. military and economic aid would be cut off. This went on until the early 90s. But there was a congressionally passed law that the president at the time couldn't veto, and that basically said the president had to certify that Pakistan didn't have an assembled nuclear weapon. And so the administration said, well, what is a philosophical question? What is an assembled nuclear weapon? Well, if it's in pieces, which it often is, because it can be quite dangerous to keep it assembled, it isn't a nuclear weapon. But in fact, it maybe takes 10 minutes to assemble it. So you have these kind of games that send a signal to Pakistan that everything's okay. And then in 98, when they tested, U.S. sanctioned them along with sanctioning India after their test. But then after 3 or 4 years, the sanctions started coming off. And Pakistan emerged as kind of an unacknowledged nuclear weapon state. And so when you have that kind of mindset, you're not really looking for trouble with Pakistan. And so I think the intelligence community, from my own point of view, ignored signs that the outside community saw, that there was some proliferation taking place. The IA saw. If you see a P1, a P1 gas centrifuge program in Iran in the 1980s, and the early 1990s, you obviously know it's coming from Pakistan, and that was ignored. I even had a briefing at the CIA in 94, 95, where on Iran, on classified, and they even talked about, it's Pakistani centrifuge. we don't know necessarily how it got there, but that didn't lead them to say, oh, maybe Pakistan is proliferating. Maybe let's look at that in more detail. So I think a lot of opportunities were lost, and I would put the blame principally on the United States. I mean, I don't know what happened in Britain. They may be just as prone to the same mistakes. I mean, I do know with British intelligence, they like to watch. You know, they really want to know. They don't necessarily want to act, because if they act, then they won't know unless they shut down the program. And but if they give away their hand, then the adversary will make sure that hand can't reach into the program anymore.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Many lost opportunities. Also, the IAEA, I think they had no authority to be looking for centrifuges under the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. The focus was on nuclear material and the nuclear facilities, but as we know, the focus was not, they didn't have the adequate tools to follow up on undeclared activities which triggered the additional protocol.
Yeah, or the attitude in the 90s, early to mid 90s, they were, despite not having additional protocol, were extremely aggressive in the case of South Africa and Iraq. Iraq, they had the authority. South Africa, they had some authority, but that same authority could have been applied to Iran, and they made some mistakes, 94, 95 time period.
I think
they regret. And, but you know, you have to, a lot of this is, you have to just push, ask questions and push. And of course, states don't like that, but there's nothing that prohibits the IA from asking questions.
I think they've learned their lesson in the meantime. Anyway, we have another question here, David from Agustina, who is thanking you for your comprehensive presentation. And she's asking, do you consider that the export control regimes have been strengthened enough from the lessons learned from this case? And do you see any particular element that could support efforts to strengthen them?
Mohammed Obardi came out in 2004 with a whole range of things to strengthen, and one of which was much stronger export controls driven by treaties, not just national laws. And none of that was really done. I mean, 1540 was a first attempt. But the export control battle has been very difficult and very slow. And I think there were some very important improvements made because of the Khan network. I mean, UAE developed very good export control laws after that. Malaysia, pretty good, but maybe not as good, or well, as good. But and other states realized that if they were going to be involved in the retransfer of sensitive goods, that they better step up their act on export controls. But overall, I think what we found, and this is through this peddling peril index, was that there's a lot of work to do, and over 100 states still don't have export controls. Now they're not as important in many cases as UAE or Malaysia or supplier states, but nonetheless, they can become the transshipment point of the future. And so they do need to have export controls, at least at a minimal level, so they're not abused. Because in the end, this was very embarrassing for UAE to be called out like this. And so I think the efforts need to continue. I mean, and also I should say that we decided our expertise really is historically on trying to understand secret nuclear weapons programs and how do those programs outfit themselves? How do they get to the point where they can build nuclear weapons, enrich uranium, and so illicit trade or illicit trade in dual-use goods, single-use goods is sort of bread and butter of our operations. And we had a workshop 8 years ago, and of us and other experts, government officials in the U.S. and someone, and again, we're all enforcement or we have our experience, and someone just said, well, are export controls effective, and are they monitored, they measured, assessed as to their effectiveness, all kinds of things measured to their effectiveness. And then when we looked at it, no, nobody is assessing the effectiveness of export controls. And that's what led us. And someone had, it wasn't me, said, oh, why don't we call it the peddling peril index? Because they remembered my book. And so that became the name I couldn't think of another one. But it really was because there had been, to that point, no effort to evaluate how effective are export controls in the world. And it was a real experience for us when we looked at all the laws, and we looked at every country's laws, had all kinds of translators involved, people fluent in that language. And it became clear to us that this huge number that don't even have export controls, or that have minimal controls that really aren't very effective. And then when we looked at other countries that had export controls, we started to find they don't enforce, they don't implement their export controls well.
Yes, and it's not, having worked in this area myself, from a practical point of view, it's not trivial too, because you have to cooperate with so many entities. You need to train the customs authorities to be able to recognize when there is a suspicious item, what is it exactly? Is it a controlled item? So it's a lot of things involved. It's really not a trivial. So you have to have the laws in force and the regulations, but you also need the people on the ground to be able to recognize when there is an illicit shipment taking place.
Yeah, and it also requires cooperation. I mean, that
cooperation is
so critical.
The most important thing, yes, and countries should really exchange information. When an item that is controlled in one country is exported to another country, then that country should be informed by default. It should not be guessing, okay, this is controlled somewhere else. Is it controlled here as well? So anyway,
and I should say I was saying things in a fairly negative way just a minute ago, and we are great believers in that we can improve export controls, and that you can create systems tailored to a country's capabilities or resources that can then help strengthen everyone's assurance that there isn't some transshipment point passing on nuclear weapons or missile or other kinds of dangerous goods or technologies.
Yeah.
But it is a net. It's not a wall. So things are always gonna slip through, and there's always going to be a need for improvement.
Yeah, I agree with you. Unfortunately, I must agree. Aziza Haidarova is asking one last question. David, in your opinion, how many countries besides those mentioned in the presentation have been able to benefit from the AQKhan program?
There's suspicion that, Syria had some interactions with Khan, and but they went up on the plutonium route, as we all know, they got help building a nuclear reactor from North Korea, which Israel then bombed in 2007, soon before it was going to operate. There were questions about Egypt, but nothing could be developed out of that. Part of the suspicion was driven as Khan was quite a traveler. Just in over several year period, he visited 23 countries and had discussions in those countries. And so, but a lot of them weren't going to be interested. But there were concerns that Sudan may have been a transshipment point for a period of time. That never really could get to the bottom of that. There also Khan network members were happy to provide the same things to India. They did not provide a centrifuge design, and we did an investigation coming on 15 years ago, where we got very deeply into centrifuge designs in India through various means, legal, but nonetheless, Indian government didn't appreciate it very much. But we could see that it was not a copy of the Urenco design. It was related. I mean, if you're going to build a centrifuge, you're going to use the Urenco principles. They were the Russian principles. That design information went from Russia to Europe, and then that fed into Urenco via captured Austrian German scientists, particularly an Austrian one named Gernot Zippo, who worked in this developing the Russian program, and then brought that key parts of that back. But you could see that there were some components in the centrifuge design that were not copies, and in fact, were giving the Indians heartburn. They weren't working like they would have if it did a copy. But go to the cascade, the piping, the equipment needed for centrifuge cascades. There's a whole lot of it, and happy to sell. And so the same things were being sold into the Indian program as that these same groups had provided to Khan's program and more broadly to Libya's program. And with North Korea, these same people were providing to North Korea, independent of this direct Pakistani government, North Korean government cooperation that derived from the Gauri missile agreement.
Yeah. Anyway, let's look at, maybe this will be the last question by Zumrat Gaibulaeva, who is asking, I think this ties somehow to your lessons learned questions. How many way do you have for renewed focus on the dangers of illicit nuclear trade? How many way do you have for a
You mean
renewed
methods? I mean, well, or you mean to understand how this trade happens? I mean, what we do it in many ways. I mean, you can look for tips in the media. You look at criminal cases. You can analyze trade data. One way that we learn a lot is through advising prosecutions. I mean, one of the things that I've done in the past is if a prosecutor asks for aid, I don't in any way make a request for money. We can fund my time, my travel, but I request the evidence. And in the US case, and it's also in Europe, prosecutors going to throw away 90% of the evidence because they have to focus on what they can prove as a criminal violation. And so that's where they go. And so we found that mining the evidence has been very fruitful, and it opens doors to all kinds of things. We work with companies. Companies are a target, and they're also the lookout for illicit trade, and they get requests for prices, inquiries, and we have investigated those for companies. And then you can see suspicious inquiries. It's a small percentage. I mean, most of the business is legitimate, but it's a small percentage that is suspicious or in fact illicit, and you can detect some of that through these inquiries, and then that opens the door to, because this inquiry would have names, phone numbers, what they're looking for, and in fact we use this collection of information to further assess the capabilities in the adversaries or allies country, depending on the case. There's other ways too. I mean, the way we got into the centrifuge program in India, I think I can say now because we kind of screwed ourselves, but they had this tender system where if the centrifuge program wanted something, they would post a public tender of what they wanted. And the tenders were obviously, well, I would say this, they wanted a centrifuge component made, it was clear which one they were asking to be made, and you could buy a tender. So we bought tenders in India. They cost $10, I think. They had this funny thing where, if you get the bid, you have to give the tender back, but if you don't get the bid, they're silent. And when we get the tender document, you could see a centrifuge part detail, the exact details needed to make that centrifuge part. And and we're a little bit like MI6 in some ways. We didn't want to reveal this because we also used the tender process to actually locate the secret Indian gas centrifuge plant. It was a tender to do some things at a plant, and it gave, which was obviously a centrifuge plant, and it gave the driving directions to that plant, so we could just go down the road, which was identified a certain distance, and like 18.5 kilometers or something, and use satellite imagery to pick out the plant. And centrifuge plants are not that easy to pick out. They're just difficult to pick out from all the other industrial buildings. And so we thought we had a great eye into this, but we were disturbed by the tenders we got by any standards in America or Europe were classified, and we had them assessed by Urenco, and by another expert. We had that they were going to work. May cause some heartburn because of one of the components, but it would work, and they shouldn't be putting them out on the public market. So we publicized them to try to get the Indian government to stop, which they did. And then you can't decipher the tenders. Within 3 months, you could no longer decipher the tenders to figure out what they were really getting at, and they put out hundreds. So we can't station someone in India to buy every tender, and they probably would have been wise to methods by that time, how we bought it. So, and we've done that in other countries too that use tendering systems. Pakistan does, and when you if you tie that or link that to companies' due diligence, because sometimes a request for price will come in from it's Singapore, let's say, just pick a country. Singapore, you can then see that request for price literally contained a copy of the tender put out by Pakistan or India, and you can then and for the company, that's enough to say we're not going to provide this. It's just, this is suspicious, particularly if it turns out the tender was issued by the company affiliated with the centrifuge or other nuclear programs in those countries. So there's a lot of things you can do to use procurement information to, one, thwart the procurement, and two, dig into the nuclear program to learn more about it.
I think it's really important to know which sources are important to follow up and to monitor illicit trade. So I have not thought about tenders, but that's really a good hint.
I'm sorry?
I have never heard about following tenders that they were publicly available. So
yeah, well, they're publicly available if you show up at the door and are represented by, in this case, an Indian company. So I couldn't walk in and get it, but it was done. And I must say, because of the story I just told you, that was a lesson to us. We rarely release publicly anything we do in this area anymore. I mean, relative to how much we do. I mean, we even had a book called Connecting the Dots that looked at case studies involving trafficking. But that's a fraction of what we do. And we constantly look at what we do, will it lead countries to better hide their illicit procurement. So we've learned that it's best to be discreet in these areas and work with your government or governments. I mean, I live in 2 countries and work with companies that are multinational. But it's best to work with the governments to pursue these cases. I mean, the only exception could be if the media comes to us with a bunch of documents. We have a case now. Media comes to us with a huge amount of documents, insider documents. That'll become largely public because the media is going to make it public.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm looking at the time. I think we are getting to the end of our webinar. In the name of all the participants, David, I would like to say again a big thank you to you for providing all these deep insights into the history, which are also of relevance for today. And I sincerely hope that nuclear export controls will get the attention that they deserve and that they should have. And with new technologies, it becomes more and more difficult to control how technology is spread around the world. But I do hope that countries will cooperate better and find a way of preventing what happened with AQKhan in the future. So,
David, do you mind if I make one more comment?
Yes, please.
Today, countries are getting better. Countries are uniting who are supporting Ukraine to try to make it so Russia cannot get as many electronic components and other types of components needed for its weapons, trying to disrupt things that go into drones. These are, for you and Ava and I, these are components we would never even look at in the past. They're so common. We're looking at more dual use components. They're used in WMD programs. These are common electronic components bought in a local electronics store, distributed all over the place. And yet the world is uniting to try to block those sales and starting to find ways to do it. So we're expanding sanctions and export controls into areas that couldn't have been even dreamed about 10 years ago. So in that sense, I feel that things have progressed. And the fact that we're working on disrupting components used in drones we're doing that now, and we wouldn't even given it 2 seconds as something possible 5 years ago.
Yeah. At the same time, you hear about a drone facility being constructed in Russia by Iran. So in that case, the question is how many of those electronics can they produce by themselves indigenously?
Very few. Very few.
Okay. Well, I'm not a drone expert, so I cannot comment.
Well, we've unfortunately, we're scientists, engineers, chemists, policy people. Our skills are fungible. So, you need information, obviously, but
yeah,
it's amazing how much does not come from Russia and Iran industries. But they.
Yeah. So anyway, David, once again, a big thank you. And it was really a pleasure and an honor, and a pleasure for me to see you online at least, and an honor for you to give us this presentation today to WiN for Peace. So thank you very much.
I'm happy to do it. And happy to do it. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, David. And thank you to all the participants. I hope you found this presentation interesting, and I hope to see you again on the disarmament webinar in a month's time. So thank you, David.
Happy to do it. Maybe we'll talk about drones. Talk about drones.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.